If you love intense HFY stories where humanity turns fear into strength, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next battle. Your support helps this channel bring you more powerful sci-fi stories full of emotion, strategy, and unforgettable human moments. 6 months after humanity officially joined the Galactic Council, Professor Talron had reached a conclusion that would either secure his place in academic history or end his career in spectacular fashion. Standing before the largest assembly hall in council headquarters, he adjusted the holographic presentation floating behind him and looked out at the gathered diplomats, researchers, military observers, and behavioral scientists from more than 40 species. After 6 months of direct observation, he announced, the Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative has produced its first comprehensive framework for predicting human decision-making. The audience erupted into polite applause. Director Vesh, seated near the front, folded his arms. Let's hope this one survives longer than the last 3 frameworks. Talron ignored the comment. Humans possess unusual emotional flexibility, but their behavior follows identifiable patterns. They value cooperation, social bonding, personal freedom, and adaptive problem-solving. Most importantly, we can now accurately predict human responses in 92% of observed scenarios. A murmur of approval spread through the hall. At the back of the room, Ambassador Nara Sol smiled into her coffee cup. She knew exactly what was about to happen. Talron continued. This achievement represents thousands of observation hours, millions of data points, and contributions from the finest minds in the council. The main doors slid open. Every head turned. A human man entered carrying a tablet under one arm and a half-finished cup of station coffee in the other. His dark hair looked like it had surrendered to gravity several hours earlier. He glanced around the packed auditorium, noticed everyone staring at him, and frowned. Did I miss free food? Silence followed. Talron closed his eyes. Nara nearly choked on her coffee. Human Lucas Mercer, Talron said slowly, you are late. Lucas checked the time on his wrist display. Technically, I'm 6 minutes early for tomorrow. Several researchers immediately began taking notes. Director Vesh looked alarmed. Was that a joke? Dr. Elix Vorin whispered. I cannot determine if he believes time functions differently for humans. Lucas walked down the aisle, completely unaware of the academic crisis he had already created. Sorry, he said. Elevator stopped on deck 14. Apparently someone thought putting a fish market next to a quantum laboratory was a good idea. There is no fish market on deck 14, Talron replied. Exactly. That's what made it so suspicious. Vesh rubbed his temples. What does that mean? No idea, Lucas said. I was hoping you could tell me. Laughter erupted from the human section. The aliens looked deeply concerned. Lucas finally sat beside Ava Chen, the human behavioral specialist assigned to the project. She leaned closer. You couldn't behave normally for one morning. I am behaving normally. That's the problem. Talron cleared his throat and resumed the presentation. As I was explaining, our framework now allows us to predict human behavior with exceptional accuracy. Lucas raised a hand. Talron immediately regretted acknowledging him. Yes, quick question. Did you account for humans lying? Of course. Accidentally? Yes. To themselves? Talron hesitated. What? Humans do that a lot. Several researchers exchanged worried looks. Lucas continued. What about pretending to be fine when they're not fine? That is emotional suppression. What about pretending to be fine because they don't know they're not fine? Talron's confidence began evaporating. Ava quietly covered her face with one hand. Human Lucas, Talron said carefully, the framework addresses behavioral variance. Cool, Lucas nodded. Then you're probably only wrong by 50%. The room exploded into confused conversation. Researchers whispered frantically. One scientist opened an entirely new file. Vesh stared at Lucas as though he were witnessing a security threat. Why would you say that? He demanded. Lucas looked genuinely surprised by the question. Because it sounded funny. Funny to whom? Me. That is not useful. Neither is station coffee, but here we are. By the time order returned, Talron's presentation had been derailed beyond recovery. His perfect charts suddenly looked fragile. His conclusions felt less certain. Worse, the researchers were no longer discussing the framework. They were discussing Lucas. As the meeting ended, Talron watched the human leave with Ava and felt a growing sense of dread. 6 months of research had produced mountains of data, but one casual conversation had exposed dozens of unanswered questions. Director Vesh approached him. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," Talron sighed. "That our framework is incomplete. That human is a public safety hazard." Across the hall, Lucas took another sip of terrible coffee and grimaced. "This tastes like regret." Ava shook her head. "One day they're going to lock you in a laboratory." Lucas shrugged. "At least then somebody will finally explain what the project is supposed to be studying." The decision to officially study Lucas Mercer was announced 3 days later, and according to Professor Talron, it represented a necessary scientific adjustment. According to Director Vesh, it represented a containment strategy. According to Lucas, it represented the most expensive mistake in Council history. The observation chamber assigned to the Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative overlooked one of Arcadia Station's main transit districts and contained enough sensors to monitor everything from emotional fluctuations to eye movement pattern. Lucas stared at the room for several seconds before looking at Ava Chen. "You know where I come from. Putting this many cameras in one room usually requires a warrant." Ava ignored him and handed him a tablet. "Just cooperate for once. That's a very vague request. Try acting natural." Lucas looked around the room. "Natural for humans or natural for me? See. That's exactly the problem." Behind the observation glass, Talron watched eagerly while Dr. Alix Vorin prepared monitoring systems. "The objective is simple," Talron explained. "We observe human Lucas Mercer in controlled social situation and identify the behavioral mechanisms responsible for his communication style." Director Vesh crossed his arms. "Translation: we figure out what is wrong with him." "Excellent." Inside the chamber, Lucas sat at a table and immediately began spinning a pen between his fingers. 3 researchers started recording the behavior. "Why are they writing that down?" he asked. Ava glanced toward the observation deck. "Because they're trying to understand humans. By watching me play with a pen, apparently." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "That explains why progress has been slow." The first experiment began 30 minutes later. Dr. Vorin entered carrying a data pad and sat opposite Lucas. "We will start with simple conversational analysis." "Sounds terrifying." Vorin ignored the comment. "Human Lucas, describe your current emotional state." "Hungry. Beyond hunger. Hungry but further away." Several researchers immediately began discussing whether humans categorized emotions spatially. Ava closed her eyes. "Lucas, what? Stop helping." "I am helping." "No, you're not," Vorin continued. "Are you comfortable being observed?" "Not especially." The researchers perked up. Finally, a serious answer. Then Lucas added, "But I've met council politicians, so my standards are already pretty low." Half the observation room dissolved into confusion. The other half started debating whether the statement reflected distrust of authority structures. The next several hours somehow became worse. When asked if humans enjoyed social interaction, Lucas replied, "Depends on the humans." When asked whether he trusted aliens, he replied, "Depends on the aliens." When asked what motivated human behavior, he replied, "Depends." Talron stared at the growing mountain of contradictory data. How can every answer be conditional? Ava looked genuinely confused by the question. Because reality is conditional. By the end of the second day, the project had expanded beyond Lucas. Marcus Kane was brought in for comparison testing. The former security officer entered the chamber, sat down, answered questions directly, and left. Talron nearly cried with relief. "Remarkable," he whispered. "A predictable human." Director Vesh nodded. "I like this one." Unfortunately, the relief lasted only 12 minutes. During a follow-up interview, Marcus was shown several examples of Lucas's recorded statements and asked whether he understood them. Mostly, Marcus replied. Mostly, Talrin asked. You can understand what he means, usually. How? Marcus shrugged. Context. The room fell silent. Explain. Not sure I can. You understand human Lucas without requiring clarification. Most of the time. Dr. Vorin looked horrified. Then the behavior is spreading. Later that afternoon, Ava joined Marcus in the station cafeteria while researchers observed from a distance. Lucas arrived carrying coffee and immediately sat down. Good news, he announced. The scientists have concluded I'm either fascinating or a public health concern. Marcus didn't even look up from his meal. Probably both. That's what I said. Through the observation window, Talrin nearly dropped his tablet. Did you see that? He asked. See what? Vesh replied. They understood each other instantly. The realization triggered a far more troubling question. The issue wasn't that Lucas behaved differently. The issue was that other humans understood him effortlessly. The next morning, Talrin gathered the research team. Holographic charts filled the room. Our assumption was incorrect, he admitted. Lucas Mercer is not the anomaly. Dr. Vorin frowned. Then what is? Talrin enlarged a communication model showing connections between human subjects. The anomaly is human-to-human understanding itself. Nobody spoke. Through 6 months of observation, the Council had collected mountains of behavioral data. They understood human physiology, decision-making patterns, social structures, and emotional responses better than ever before. Yet the simplest question remained unanswered. How did humans understand each other so easily when their behavior appeared so inconsistent? Across the station, completely unaware that he had just triggered another research crisis, Lucas took a sip of coffee, grimaced, and muttered, "One day somebody's going to explain why this stuff is legal." 3 days after Professor Talrin concluded that human-to-human understanding might be the real mystery, the Galactic Council received a problem that immediately pushed behavioral research into the background. A trade dispute between the Verk Consortium and the Selari Union had been growing for weeks, but what began as a disagreement over shipping routes had now escalated into suspended contracts, military patrol deployments, and enough political tension to make every diplomat on Arcadia Station nervous. Director Vesh entered the research division carrying a tablet and an expression that suggested someone had personally offended him. "Emergency council session," he announced. "The negotiations are collapsing." Talrin looked up from a stack of behavioral reports. "Then why are you here?" Vesh stared at him. "Because someone suggested bringing Lucas Mercer." Silence filled the room. Dr. Vorin slowly lowered his data pad. "As a solution, apparently." Talrin looked horrified. "Who suggested that?" "Ambassador Nara Sol." Nobody was surprised. 2 hours later, Lucas found himself sitting inside one of the largest diplomatic chambers on the station. Representatives from both governments occupied opposite sides of a massive circular table. The Verk delegates sat rigidly upright while the Selari representatives appeared equally determined not to blink first. The atmosphere felt less like a negotiation and more like two predators deciding who would move first. Lucas leaned toward Ava. "Quick question." "No, I haven't asked it yet." "I know." Marcus Kane sat behind them as part of station security and looked thoroughly unimpressed by the entire situation. "Try not to start an interstellar incident," he said. "That's a very low bar for success." The lead Verk representative began the meeting. "The Selari Union has repeatedly violated established transportation agreements." The Selari ambassador immediately replied, "Your interpretation of those agreements is inaccurate. Our interpretation follows the signed treaty. Your interpretation follows whatever benefits you." The argument escalated almost immediately. For the next hour, accusations flew back and forth while negotiators desperately attempted to maintain order. Lucas spent most of the time drinking coffee and looking bored. Finally, the Verk representative turned toward him. "Human Mercer." Lucas looked up. "That's me. You have remained silent." "I was enjoying the show." Several diplomats looked alarmed. Talrin nearly fell out of his chair in the observation gallery. "Why would he say that?" Dr. Vorin whispered. "Because he's Lucas." The Verk representative narrowed his eyes. You find this amusing? Not amusing exactly. Lucas took another sip of coffee. More educational. Educational. I've learned that both sides are absolutely convinced they're right. The Selari ambassador folded her arms. And what conclusion does that lead you to? Lucas considered the question. That somebody's probably wrong. For a moment nobody spoke. Then, unexpectedly, a few delegates laughed. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Not much, just enough to break the rhythm of the argument. The Verk representative stared at Lucas. You believe the matter is that simple? No. Then explain. Lucas set his cup down. For the first time all day, his expression became serious. The problem isn't the trade route. Every conversation stopped. Then what is the problem? The Selari ambassador asked. Trust. Several delegates exchanged confused looks. Lucas continued. If either side trusted the other, this dispute would have been solved 3 weeks ago. Nobody interrupted him now. You're arguing over shipping lanes because it's safer than admitting you don't trust each other. The room grew quiet. Ava noticed the change immediately. This wasn't the version of Lucas most researchers saw. This was the one that appeared when something actually mattered. The root dispute isn't the crisis, Lucas said. It's the symptom. Even Director Vesh seemed interested now. The Verk representative frowned. And your solution? Start acting like trading partners instead of rival empires. The Selari ambassador laughed softly. That sounds remarkably simple. Most solutions are. Then why are they difficult? Lucas smiled faintly. Because people are involved. For several seconds nobody responded. Then, unexpectedly, the Verk representative leaned back in his chair. Human Mercer. Yeah, was that sarcasm? Half the room immediately focused on Lucas. Ava covered her face. Marcus looked toward the ceiling. Somewhere in the observation gallery, Tauren stopped breathing. Lucas thought about the question for a moment. Honestly, yes, I have no idea anymore. The chamber erupted into laughter. Even a few of the diplomats joined in. The argument that had dominated the room for hours suddenly felt less hostile. The issue wasn't resolved. Not yet. But for the first time all day, both sides were speaking to each other instead of at each other. Later that evening, Tauren reviewed the recordings for the 7th time. Every behavioral model suggested Lucas should have made the situation worse. Instead, he had somehow reduced tensions, redirected the conversation, and helped restart negotiations. The researcher stared at the screen in disbelief. I don't understand, he admitted. Director Vesh folded his arms. Neither do I. Across the station, Lucas sat with Ava and Marcus in a quiet cafe overlooking the transit district. Ava shook her head. You know they're trying to figure out what happened in there. Lucas groaned. Again, Marcus smirked. You solved a diplomatic crisis. No, I didn't. Ava raised an eyebrow. Then, what did you do? Lucas stared out the window for a moment. I got everyone to stop acting like enemies long enough to remember they weren't. Neither Ava nor Marcus replied. For once, there wasn't really anything to add. The success of the negotiations should have been the end of the story. Unfortunately for Professor Tauren, it only made the situation worse. For the next week, the Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative became the single most discussed research project on Arcadia Station. The official reason was Lucas Mercer's role in preventing a diplomatic breakdown. The unofficial reason was that nobody could agree on how he had done it. Tauren stood at the center of the research division staring at a wall-sized holographic display covered in notes, behavioral charts, communication patterns, and recorded conversation. Every time he believed he was approaching an answer, another contradiction appeared. This makes no sense, he muttered. Dr. Elix Voren looked equally exhausted. I have reviewed the negotiation recordings 12 times, and I understand less now than I did before. Director Vesh entered carrying a stack of reports. Good news. Tauren looked hopeful for the first time all morning. You found something. No, Vesh dropped the reports onto a table. Now multiple governments are asking for Lucas Mercer during future negotiations. Tauren looked horrified again. Across the station, Lucas was completely unaware of the crisis surrounding him. He sat in a quiet observation lounge drinking coffee while Ava Chen reviewed reports on her tablet. Marcus Kane occupied a nearby chair and appeared to be enjoying the rare absence of chaos. "You know," Ava said without looking up, "you're becoming a problem." Lucas frowned. "I've always been a problem. A bigger problem. That's called professional growth." Marcus snorted into his drink. Several decks away, Talron had reached a conclusion. It was not one he enjoyed. He immediately requested a meeting with the entire human team. 2 hours later, Lucas, Ava, and Marcus found themselves seated inside the main research chamber. Talron activated a holographic display containing hundreds of behavioral records. "I believe we've been approaching the project incorrectly." Lucas looked impressed. "Only took 4 months. Talron ignored him. "Initially we assumed Lucas Mercer represented an unusual example of human communication. That's because I do. Please stop helping." "Sorry, no you're not." "Fair point." Several researchers quietly updated their notes. Talron enlarged a series of recordings showing interactions between the 3 humans. "Our data suggests Lucas is not the primary anomaly." Ava exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Then what is?" Talron highlighted dozens of conversations. "Your ability to understand each other." The room became quiet. "Explain," Marcus said. "When Lucas speaks, researchers struggle to determine his intent. Yet both of you interpret him correctly almost every time." Ava nodded slowly. "Because we know him." "That answer is insufficient." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "That's scientist language for 'I don't like the answer,'" Talron continued. "You understand his tone, context, body language, emotional state, history, relationships, and intentions simultaneously." Ava blinked. "That's called talking to someone." "Exactly." Talron pointed dramatically at the display. "How?" Nobody answered for several seconds. Finally Marcus shrugged. "Experience." The researchers looked disappointed. "Seriously," Marcus continued. "You spend enough time around someone, you learn how they think." "Even when they are inconsistent?" Dr. Voren asked. "Especially when they're inconsistent." The room became silent again. Lucas watched the researchers struggling with the concept and almost felt bad for them. "Almost. You're trying to build a formula," he said. Talron frowned. "Of course. Humans don't really work that way. Everything works that way, not people." The researcher opened his mouth to argue before stopping himself. Lucas continued. "You keep treating behavior like mathematics. Behavior can be modeled. Sure, up to a point." Lucas gestured toward Ava and Marcus. "I know Marcus is probably going to tell me when I'm being stupid." "Frequently," Marcus confirmed. "I know Ava's going to explain things in the most reasonable way possible. Somebody has to. And they know how I think." Talron stared at him. "You're describing relationships. Congratulations. You're catching up." Ava laughed despite herself. The conversation should have ended there, but Talron was too invested to stop. "Then explain sarcasm." Every human in the room groaned. "Seriously?" Lucas asked. "Yes, you always come back to sarcasm. Because it makes no sense." Lucas thought for a moment. "Okay, imagine Marcus says something ridiculous. That happens less often than people think. Work with me." Marcus sighed. "Fine. If I make a sarcastic comment, Marcus knows whether I'm joking because he knows me." Talron considered this. "So sarcasm depends on familiarity." "Partly." "Partly? Welcome to humanity." Hours later, after dozens more questions and very few satisfying answers, the meeting finally ended. Talron remained alone in the research chamber staring at his notes. For months he had been trying to understand human behavior through observation, data collection, and predictive models. Now he was beginning to suspect that the answer might be far simpler and far more complicated at the same time. Humans understood each other because they invested time in understanding each other. The realization should have been encouraging. Instead, it created an entirely new problem. Because if that was true, then no amount of data would ever be enough. Meanwhile, Lucas exited the chamber with Ava and Marcus. "How do you think that went?" Ava asked. "Poorly," Marcus nodded. "Very poorly." Lucas smiled. Good, that means they're learning. Professor Talron had not slept properly in 3 days. The fact disturbed him less than the reason. Across the history of his academic career, every problem had eventually yielded to observation, analysis, and patience. Human behavior, however, appeared to operate under entirely different rules. Worse, he had made the mistake of telling Lucas Mercer that he was close to a breakthrough. The human had smiled. Talron should have recognized the warning signs immediately. The main conference chamber of the Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative was packed with researchers, diplomats, military observers, and scientists from dozens of species. Months of work had led to this presentation. Hundreds of interviews, thousands of observations, and enough behavioral data to fill entire station archives had finally produced what Talron believed was the most complete model of human interaction ever created. Director Vesh sat in the front row looking cautiously optimistic. Dr. Vorin looked nervous. Ambassador Nara Saul looked entertained. That should have worried everyone. Today, Talron announced proudly, we present the Unified Human Behavioral Framework. A massive holographic display illuminated the room. Charts appeared. Relationship models rotated slowly through the air. Communication maps connected dozens of behavioral patterns. Our research demonstrates that human understanding is built upon contextual familiarity, emotional recognition, shared experience, and adaptive interpretation. Several researchers nodded approvingly. Most importantly, Talron continued, we have successfully isolated the variables responsible for sarcasm. Lucas immediately started laughing. Ava kicked his chair. Try to survive 5 minutes. I'm trying. Try harder. Talron pressed forward. Contrary to previous assumptions, sarcasm is not random. It functions according to identifiable social conditions. More charts appeared. When familiarity reaches specific thresholds, humans utilize sarcasm as a form of trust-building communication. Dr. Vorin smiled proudly. Additionally, we have identified predictive indicators that allow accurate sarcasm detection in 87% of observed cases. The audience erupted into applause. Director Vesh actually looked relieved. For the first time in months, the project appeared to be ending. Talron looked directly at Lucas. Human Mercer, do you have any comments? Ava buried her face in her hands. Marcus quietly moved his chair further away. Lucas stood slowly. You really want my opinion? Yes, the honest version. Obviously, that's a terrible idea. Laughter spread through the human section. Talron remained confident. Proceed. Lucas stared at the holographic framework for several moments. Most of this is actually pretty good. The room brightened immediately. Talron looked vindicated. Then Lucas continued. There's just one problem. Every researcher froze. One, Talron asked carefully. Tiny problem. What problem? Lucas pointed toward a rotating communication model. You built this using people who already know each other. Silence filled the room. Of course, Talron replied. That was our primary data source. Right, Lucas nodded. So how does your model explain strangers? Nobody answered immediately. Lucas continued. Humans use sarcasm with friends differently than with coworkers. He pointed toward another section. Different with family. Another section. Different online. Another. Different under stress. Talron's confidence began evaporating. Those are secondary variables. No, Lucas shook his head. Those are different situations. Several researchers exchanged worried looks. Ava realized exactly where this was heading. Lucas, I'm being helpful. That's the concerning part. Lucas walked toward the display. Look, your framework works great for explaining why Marcus understands me. Marcus sighed. Unfortunately, see, Lucas pointed. Perfect example. The audience laughed. But your model assumes understanding comes after familiarity, Talron frowned. Doesn't it? Not always. Explain. Lucas looked around the room. How many people here understood that joke? Dozens of hands rose immediately. Humans, aliens, researchers, diplomats, security personnel. Lucas smiled. Most of them don't know Marcus. The room became very quiet. For the first time all day, nobody was taking notes. They were thinking. Humans aren't constantly decoding individual words, Lucas continued. They're reading situations. Dr. Voren stared at him. Context again. Everything is context. Talron slowly sat down. The realization was beginning to form. His framework wasn't wrong. It was incomplete, again. You built a map, Lucas said. That's useful. But you keep acting like the map is the territory. Vesh looked confused. What does that mean? It means reality is messier than diagrams. Narasol laughed loudly from the back of the room. Welcome to humanity. The presentation never truly recovered. The framework wasn't discarded. It remained one of the most comprehensive studies ever conducted, but the illusion of a final answer disappeared. By the end of the meeting, Talron found himself sitting alone in the empty conference chamber staring at the inactive holographic display. Months of work remained valuable, yet somehow the finish line had moved again. The doors opened behind him. Lucas entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, peace offering. Talron accepted one cautiously. You destroyed my presentation. Only a little. A little? Okay, maybe a medium amount. For several seconds neither spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Talron started laughing. Not politely, not academically, actually laughing. Lucas looked surprised. You all right? No, Talron shook his head. But for the first time I think that's progress. Lucas smiled. See, you're learning already. 2 weeks after the collapse of Professor Talron's so-called final framework, the Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative gathered for what was supposed to be its concluding session. Nobody was entirely sure how it had happened. The project had begun as a straightforward attempt to help the Galactic Council better understand humanity during its first 6 months of membership. Somewhere along the way, it had transformed into one of the largest interdisciplinary studies in Council history. Linguists had joined, psychologists had joined, intelligence analysts had joined, military strategists had somehow joined. At one point, an agricultural scientist had accidentally attended 3 meetings before realizing he was in the wrong department and, according to the records, had still contributed useful observations. The final assembly filled the largest conference chamber on Arcadia Station. Representatives from dozens of species occupied the audience. Director Vesh sat in his usual seat with the exhausted expression of someone who had spent months attempting to understand humans and regretted every second of it. Dr. Voren reviewed his notes one final time. Ambassador Narasol looked entirely too pleased with herself. Ava Chen and Marcus Kane sat together near the front. Lucas Mercer arrived exactly 4 minutes late carrying coffee. Good, Vesh muttered. I was worried this meeting might start normally. Lucas took his seat. Don't worry, I'm here now. Talron stepped forward to the center of the chamber. Unlike previous presentations, there were no elaborate charts floating behind him, no predictive models, no complicated diagrams, just a simple title, Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative, Final Findings. The researcher looked older than when the project began. Somehow he also looked happier. When this initiative started, Talron said, we believed understanding humanity would be a matter of sufficient observation and analysis. A few researchers laughed quietly. That assumption was incorrect. More laughter followed. Even Talron smiled. Over 6 months we observed human diplomacy, problem-solving, communication, conflict resolution, cooperation, humor, stress responses, social bonding, and countless other behaviors. He paused. We learned a great deal. Another display appeared behind him. This one contained only a few short statements. Humans value relationships more than efficiency. Humans frequently make decisions that appear irrational when viewed without context. Humans can maintain disagreement without hostility. Humans adapt faster than most predictive models allow. He glanced toward Lucas. And humans possess an extraordinary ability to understand one another despite inconsistent behavior. The audience listened carefully. Initially we believed the mystery was sarcasm. Laughter spread through the room again. It turns out sarcasm was never the mystery. Dr. Voren nodded slowly. The mystery was trust. The chamber became quiet. Tauren continued. Again and again our research returned to the same conclusion. Human communication functions because humans spend enormous amounts of time learning one another. They observe, they adapt, they make mistakes, they correct misunderstandings. They build context. Ava smiled faintly. Marcus folded his arms. Lucas remained unusually quiet. In other words, Tauren said, humans do not require complete understanding before choosing cooperation. That statement lingered in the air. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't revolutionary. Yet somehow it explained more than months of research ever had. The Council expected humanity to become understandable once enough data was collected, Tauren said. Instead, we discovered that understanding itself is often a relationship rather than a destination. Even Director Vesh looked thoughtful. Tauren finally turned toward Lucas. Human Mercer, Lucas sighed. I knew this was coming. You have been the single most frustrating subject in the history of this project. That's going on my resume. Probably. The room laughed. Tauren held up a data pad. This report contains over 12,000 pages. Lucas nearly dropped his coffee. 12,000. You are responsible for an unreasonable percentage of them. I should be receiving royalties. You should be receiving supervision. More laughter. Then Tauren became serious. Before we officially conclude this initiative, I have one final question. The room immediately grew silent. Everyone knew this mattered. After 6 months of studying humanity, Tauren said, what is the most important thing we still don't understand? For once, Lucas didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, at Ava, at Marcus, at the researchers who had spent months trying to decode behavior that often confused humans themselves, at Tauren, who had begun this project believing every answer could be found in a chart. Honestly, Lucas asked. Yes, you're still asking the wrong question, Tauren laughed softly. Of course we are. You keep asking what humans are. Lucas leaned back in his chair. The better question is why humans keep choosing each other despite all the reasons not to. Nobody spoke. People disagree. They misunderstand each other. They annoy each other. Lucas glanced toward Marcus. Constantly. You're one to talk, Marcus replied. And yet, Lucas continued, most of the time they stay anyway. The silence that followed felt different from the others. It wasn't confusion. It was understanding. Real understanding. Not because someone had finally discovered the perfect model, but because they had finally stopped looking for one. Several moments passed before Tauren cleared his throat. Human Mercer. Yeah, was any of that sarcasm? The room froze. Ava immediately started laughing. Marcus shook his head. Nara covered her face. Even Vesh looked exhausted. Lucas took a slow sip of coffee and smiled. Professor, yes, after 6 months I would have thought you'd know better than to ask. The entire chamber erupted into laughter as the Human Behavioral Understanding Initiative officially came to an end. Months later, long after the final reports were archived, researchers would still debate the meaning of countless conversations. They would continue studying humanity. They would continue making mistakes, but one lesson remained. Understanding people was never about finding a perfect answer. It was about deciding they were worth understanding in the first place.